May 12th, 2026, Lhotse Base Camp, Nepal. A 37-year-old Polish software engineer who lives in a van had just become the first person in history to ski the world's fourth highest mountain from summit to base camp, without oxygen, without a single person watching. The 2026 Everest spring season was already historic before anyone reached the summit. Nepal had issued 494 climbing permits, the highest number ever recorded in a single season. China had closed the northern Tibetan route entirely, funneling every climber on Earth onto the single southern Nepal approach. Base camp had become a temporary city of tents, Sherpa crews, film teams, and commercial expeditions, all waiting for the same narrow weather windows. Every major expedition operator on the planet had a team on the mountain. The summit push, when it came, would be the most crowded single event in the recorded history of mountaineering. But while the world watched 494 permit holders inch toward the summit in one of the longest queues in Himalayan history, one man was doing something else entirely. The part I find most extraordinary about this story is that it wasn't just one historic first. It was two, separated by 7 days, done by a man most people in mountaineering had never heard of. This wasn't one bold decision. It was a chain of quiet, methodical choices that rewrote what we thought was possible on the highest mountains on Earth. This is the story of the quiet madman stealing the Everest 2026 season. Welcome to Tourist Tragedies. Bartek Ziemski does not have a social media account. He does not have sponsors. He does not have a film crew. He is, by his own description, not a mountaineer at all. He is a 37-year-old Polish skier who occasionally takes on software engineering contracts to fund his next expedition, and who lives out of a van between climbs. He carries his own tent, his own food, his own skis on his backup mountains above 8,000 meters. He asks strangers to photograph him on summits because there is no one else to ask. In 5 years, Ziemski had quietly become one of the most accomplished ski mountaineers alive. 9 8,000-meter peaks descended on skis, each without bottled oxygen, most without a companion at the top. He operates in the Polish mountaineering tradition, which prizes suffering over spectacle and achievement over audience. Almost nobody outside of a small community knew his name. That was entirely by design. To understand what Ziemski was attempting in May of 2026, you need to understand what skiing an 8,000-meter peak actually means. Not a few graceful turns for a drone camera before clipping back into crampons and walking out. A full ski descent, summit to base camp. Skis on at the top, skis off only when the glacier levels out at the bottom. The terrain between the Lhotse summit and base camp includes vertical ice faces, 45 to 50-degree couloirs barely wider than a car, shattered glacial debris, and one of the most dangerous corridors in the natural world, the Khumbu Icefall. That icefall is a river of glacial ice moving so fast it produces house-sized blocks called seracs, towers of unstable ice that collapse without warning. Commercial teams cross it in darkness, early in the morning, moving as quickly as possible along aluminum ladders stretched over crevasses the depth of 12-story buildings. The standard procedure for every climber on the mountain is to take your skis off at the top of the icefall and walk. On Lhotse, the previous benchmark for a ski descent had been set in 2018 by Hilary Nelson and Jim Morrison, two of the most celebrated ski mountaineers in the world, who descended from the summit through a tight 50-degree couloir to Camp 2, stopped there, removed their skis, and walked out through the icefall with Sherpa support and bottled oxygen. That achievement earned Nelson the National Geographic Adventurer of the Year award and propelled both climbers to the top of their sport. Bartek Ziemski planned to ski past Camp 2, past Camp 3, past the icefall entrance. He planned to ski through the icefall itself, from the top all the way to base camp without stopping. Ziemski arrived in Nepal in early April of 2026. He did not go directly to Everest Base Camp. He spent weeks acclimatizing on Mera Peak, a 21,000-foot mountain east of the Khumbu Valley, climbing it solo before hiking to base camp quietly, without announcement. His plan for Lhotse was precise. He wanted to be the first climber to the summit that season, before the fixed ropes were established, before commercial traffic had changed the snow conditions on the face. fresh, uncompressed snow holds differently than track snow packed by hundreds of boots. It is the difference between a controllable descent and an uncontrollable one. He was not trying to prove a point. He was managing his risk with the only tool available to a man who carries everything himself: timing. On the night of May 11th, 2026, at 1 in the morning, with no Sherpas ahead of him, no fixed ropes, and no supplemental oxygen, Bartek Ziemski left Camp 4 on Lhotse and began breaking trail upward in the dark. He was alone on the fourth highest mountain on Earth. Commercial expeditions were still sleeping, waiting for ropes to be set, waiting for guides to confirm safe passage. Ziemski was already moving. He reached the summit just after noon on May 12th, the first person to stand on Lhotse in the entire 2026 season. He strapped his skis to his boots at 8,516 meters above sea level, where the air contains roughly 1/3 of the oxygen available at sea level, where each breath delivers barely enough to keep the body conscious. He looked down the Lhotse face, and then he pushed off. The descent took hours. He skied through the upper couloir, across the Lhotse face, past Camp 3, past Camp 2, through every section that had stopped every previous skier on this mountain. He reached the top of the Khumbu Icefall, the section that every skier in history had removed their skis to cross, and kept his skis on. He navigated the moving, fractured glacier. The aluminum ladders stretched over house-sized crevasses, the seracs leaning overhead. He crossed the entire icefall in his skis without stepping out of them once. He arrived at Everest Base Camp at 4:38 in the afternoon, summit to base camp, without stopping, without oxygen. A complete first in the history of high-altitude skiing. 7 days later, May 19th, 2026, Everest. By this point, the summit window had arrived and the mountain had become something close to a highway. Hundreds of climbers were working their way up the South Col route in single file, clipped to fixed ropes, waiting for the person ahead to move. On May 20th, 274 people reached the summit in a single day, a new all-time record for the Nepal side, surpassing the previous record of 223 set in 2019. 3 workers had already died on the mountain that season. Bartek Ziemski had a different problem inside that chaos. He needed to ski down a mountain that 274 other people were trying to go up. He had no team to clear the route, no drone to scout the line, no one at Camp 4 waiting with warm food. He left his high camp, climbed to the summit of the highest point on Earth, and had to ask a nearby stranger to take a photograph of him at the top. Then he strapped on his skis. Quick heads up, every week I drop a new update you won't find anywhere else. Please subscribe. To understand why skiing Everest without oxygen is a fundamentally different proposition than skiing it with oxygen, you need to understand what the body is doing above 8,000 meters. Above that threshold, the death zone, atmospheric pressure is so low that blood cannot absorb enough oxygen to maintain normal brain and muscle function. The body begins breaking down. Decision-making deteriorates. Fine motor control degrades. Muscles starve faster than the cardiovascular system can supply oxygen to them. Most commercial climbers begin on supplemental oxygen at base camp and remain on it continuously until they descend below the death zone. Skiing requires rapid, precise, reactive movement. Every turn a split-second read of slope angle and instant weight transfer. Doing this on a 45-degree ice face at over 8,000 meters, with a brain running on perhaps 40% of normal oxygen, is not a variation of ordinary skiing. It is a different discipline entirely. The descent of Everest began. He skied from the summit down the South Col route. At Camp 4, he stopped briefly to pack up his tent, the one he had carried to the top of Everest alone and would carry back down. He continued. He plunged down the Lhotse face following a direct line, the same steep corridor he had skied 7 days earlier on the neighboring peak. Past Camp 3, past Camp 2. He reached the Khumbu Icefall, and again, for the second time in 7 days on 2 different mountains, he kept his skis on. The full descent, from the summit of the highest mountain on Earth to base camp, took him under 5.5 hours. He had skied 11,400 feet of vertical in the time most people watch a film. He arrived at base camp. He sat down. The mountaineering community's reaction was quiet at first, and then it wasn't. The Polish Mountaineering Association confirmed both descents. Explorer Web ran the story. Outside Magazine profiled him from base camp within hours of his return. The details that emerged made the story stranger the more closely you read them. He had no social media on which to announce the achievement. He gave an interview by phone the morning after the Lhotse descent and described the experience as easy, not with bravado, not performing humility, but the way a person describes a commute. He was slightly puzzled that anyone found it remarkable. He had skied down. Of course it was easy. He rested briefly at base camp, 37 years old, alone, living in a van, and he had just completed the two most significant ski descents in the history of high-altitude mountaineering within a single week. When you lay the sequence of events in order, a clear picture begins to form. This was not a reckless climber getting lucky. This was a methodical operator removing every controllable variable. He chose Lhotse first, before the fixed ropes, because he needed untracked snow for a safe descent. He chose a 1 a.m. start because frozen snow holds, warm snow slides. He carried his own tent to Camp 4 because a shelter was not a luxury. It was his only safety margin if something went wrong. He trained by skiing 8 other 8,000-meter peaks over 5 years, building an oxygen-free altitude fitness profile that most athletes cannot approach. He did not attempt Everest until he had skied Lhotse 7 days earlier, confirming his body could function at those altitudes without oxygen. The Khumbu Icefall decision, keeping his skis on both times, was not impulse. He assessed it as skiable in the conditions of 2026, and he skied it. There is a concept in high-altitude alpinism called the quiet competence tradition, the Polish school of mountaineering that produced the first winter ascents of 8,000-meter peaks, done not for cameras, but because the problems existed and demanded solving. The 2026 Everest season produced a record number of summits, a record number of permits, and a record single-day crowd. It also produced Bartek Ziemski, a man with no sponsors, no social media, and no support team, who quietly completed the two most significant ski descents in the history of high-altitude mountaineering in the span of 1 week. History does not always arrive looking like a Red Bull production. Sometimes it looks like a man carrying his own tent up a mountain no one else has summited yet that season. Skiing down the section everyone else takes off their skis to walk through, and describing the whole thing as easy. The 2026 Everest season will be remembered for its record crowds. It should be remembered for the one man going the other direction. Do you think Nepal should cap permit numbers to protect what is left of genuine mountaineering on Everest? Or does the mountain belong to everyone willing to pay? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one.